I had been watching him for 11 days before he knew I existed, and by the time he understood what I had done, it was too late to matter. That asymmetry, the gap between when I began and when he noticed, was the entire architecture of what I accomplished. And I want you to understand from the beginning that there was nothing accidental about it. Every hour of those 11 days was deliberate. Every conversation I initiated, and every silence I maintained, and every position I placed myself in within the market, the church, the post office, the three streets that constituted the navigable center of the town of Biała Podlaska in the autumn of 1936, was chosen with the specific intention of building a picture of a man that was complete enough to bring to the authorities, with something they had not managed to assemble in 4 years of official investigation, which was evidence sufficient to act on. I was 52 years old, and I had been a nun for 24 years, and I had never done anything like this before, which turned out to be an advantage rather than a liability, because the man I was watching had spent 4 years learning how to recognize the people who were watching him, and I was not the kind of person he had learned to recognize. My name is Sister Radosława Kaczmarek, and I am going to tell you how I captured Marek Doliga, and I am going to tell you why I did it, and I am going to tell you what it cost, because all three parts belong together, and separating them would be dishonest in a way that I have never been willing to be about anything in my life. You need to understand what Marek Doliga was before you can understand why capturing him required what it required. He had been operating in the eastern Mazovian region since 1932, which is 4 years before I arrived in Biała Podlaska. And in those 4 years, he had constructed a criminal enterprise that was notable not for its violence, though there was violence in it, but for its intelligence. He was not the kind of criminal who relied on force as his primary method. He was the kind who relied on information, on knowing what other people needed and feared and owed, and using that knowledge to place himself in a position where the people around him served his purposes without clearly understanding that they were doing so. He ran an extortion network that operated through legitimate seeming businesses: a grain trading operation, a small transport company, a lending arrangement that began as a service and became a trap. He had connections to officials in the regional administration that had protected him from the consequences of two formal investigations, and the investigators who had worked those cases had found themselves subsequently transferred, discredited, or both. He was 41 years old in 1936, and he had never spent a single night in a cell. And he carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who has tested the system that is supposed to constrain him and found it insufficient. I came to Biała Podlaska in September 1936 to serve at the parish attached to the local church, assigned there by the diocese to assist with the school and the charitable work the parish conducted for the poorest families in the area. I had spent the previous 8 years at a convent in Lublin, and before that, 16 years at two other postings. And in all of those years, the work I had done was the work that nuns do: teaching, nursing, feeding, accompanying. I was good at it. I was particularly good at the part of it that required paying close attention to the people in front of me, reading what they needed and what they feared, and what they were not saying as precisely as what they were, because that quality of attention is what allows genuine help rather than generic help, and I had been practicing it for 24 years. It was that quality of attention that first registered Marek Dolega as something requiring more attention than I was already giving everything. I encountered him first at the Saturday market in the second week of October, 3 weeks after my arrival. He was moving through the market stalls with the ease of a man who knew everyone and was known by everyone, stopping to speak, clasping hands, occasionally resting his arm across someone's shoulder, in a gesture that from a distance looked like warmth, and from closer proximity, which I was at because I was purchasing vegetables from the adjacent stall, had a quality to it that warmth does not have. Warmth releases. This gesture held. The man whose shoulder it rested on was a farmer of perhaps 55, a man I had already met through the parish, named Vladislav Chaika. And Vladislav Chaika's face during the 30 seconds that Dolega's arm was across his shoulder was the face of a man managing something he had been managing for a long time and had not managed to put down. I filed that observation and continued purchasing vegetables and did not look at Dolega again that morning, which was itself a choice rather than an oversight. Over the following week, I visited 12 families in the parish who were connected to the charitable work I had been assigned to coordinate. 3 of those 12 families showed me the same face that Władysław Chaika had shown at the market, the face of managed long-term burden. And in each of the 3 cases, when I listened carefully to the conversation around and beneath the conversation we were officially having, I heard references to obligations and arrangements and situations that had a common texture without having a common explicit subject. People in sustained fear of a specific person develop a vocabulary of avoidance around that person's name and activities that is consistent and recognizable once you have learned to hear it. And I had spent 24 years listening to people describe their lives in the partial and indirect way that people describe the parts of their lives that carry the most weight. By the end of that first week, I had a shape without a name. By the end of the second week, when I had spoken with 6 more families and had 2 conversations at the post office and 1 extended exchange with the woman who sold bread from a cart outside the church, I had a name. I went to the police on the 1st of November with what I had assembled, which was a detailed account of 7 families who were paying protection money through mechanisms disguised as legitimate commercial transactions, the names of 2 officials who appeared to be receiving payments in exchange for administrative cooperation, and a timeline of Delega's activities reconstructed from the fragments that 11 days of careful listening had provided. The senior officer at the Biała Podlaska post listened to me for 40 minutes and then told me, with the particular courtesy that men extend to women they are not taking seriously, that these were serious allegations that would require careful investigation and that he would look into the matter. He did not write anything down while I was speaking. I noticed this. I thanked him for his time, and I left, and I stood in the street outside the police post, and I made the assessment that the assessment required, which was that the official channel had just demonstrated exactly why it had not resolved this situation in 4 years, and that I needed to find a different approach. I wrote to Warsaw. I wrote to the National Criminal Investigation Bureau, a letter of 7 pages that took me 4 evenings to compose, in which I documented everything I had gathered with the precision and the organization that 24 years of administrative convent work had given me, structured the way I had learned from the legal documents that passed through every institution I had served, with clear statements of fact distinguished clearly from inference, with sources identified with enough specificity to be verifiable, and with a final section that laid out the connection between the local official corruption and Dolega's continued operation in terms that were direct and unambiguous. I sent this letter on the 5th of November with a copy to the diocesan office in Warsaw because I had learned in 24 years of institutional life that documents sent to single recipients disappear more easily than documents sent to multiple recipients simultaneously. While I waited for a response, I continued the work that had brought me to Biała Podlaska, teaching in the school, visiting the sick, organizing the charitable distribution. I also continued watching Dolega, more carefully now and with a second objective, beyond understanding, which was documentation. I began keeping a journal of specific observations, dated and timed, of Dolega's movements and meetings, and the specific individuals he met with, and for how long, and what the visible tenor of those meetings appeared to be. I did this in a small notebook that I kept in the inner pocket of my habit, and which I wrote in immediately after each observation, while the details were still precise, because precision decays faster than people expect, and documentation that is not made immediately is documentation that contains the errors of delayed memory. After 3 weeks of this, I had something that I had not had before, a pattern. Dolega's movements followed a rhythm that had a logic to it, and the logic revealed the structure of what he was doing more clearly than any single observation could have done alone. The response from Warsaw arrived on the 22nd of November. It was not a letter. It was 2 men in plain clothes who arrived at the parish in a car with Warsaw registration plates, and who asked to speak with me privately, and who, over the following 2 hours in the small office Father Thomas allowed me to use, read every page of my 7-page letter and asked questions that were specific and detailed and wrote down the answers, which told me within the first 15 minutes that these were not men who were going to thank me politely and do nothing. They were investigators who had been looking for an entry point into Delega's operation for 18 months and who had been blocked at every attempt by the local official connections I had identified in my letter, and who had needed someone outside the local system to provide documentation that did not pass through the channels that Delega's connections controlled. I was that someone. My letter had been that documentation. The copy to the diocesan office had, I learned later, been forwarded through a bishop who had his own concerns about the situation in the eastern Mazovian region, and who had added his authority to the request for serious investigation in ways that made the request significantly harder to redirect or bury. The investigators spent 9 days in Biała Podlaska. I provided them with my observation journal and spent 4 of those 9 days in conversation with them, answering questions and clarifying details, and identifying the specific families who might be willing to speak formally if they were provided with sufficient protection guarantees. 3 of the 7 families I had spoken with agreed to make formal statements. The 2 officials I had identified in my letter were placed under surveillance that was conducted from outside the local structure, and which they therefore did not receive warning of through the channels that had protected Delega in the previous investigations. On the 30th of November, 21 days after my letter reached Warsaw, Marek Delega was arrested at his grain trading office in Biała Podlaska. The 2 officials were arrested the same morning. The investigation that followed lasted 8 months and produced convictions that the regional court handed down in July 1937. Delega received 12 years. The officials received lesser sentences that were nonetheless sufficient to remove them from positions where they could protect anyone. I want to tell you what happened in the parish after the arrest, because it is the part of the story that I think matters most, more than the arrest itself, more than the investigation, more than the convictions. The 12 families who had been paying into Delega's protection arrangements stopped paying. The grain trading business collapsed without its central figure and its official protections, and the transport company and the lending arrangement collapsed with it. Vladislav Chaika, the farmer whose face I had read at the market in the second week of October, came to me 3 weeks after the arrest and sat in the small office for a long time without saying very much. And then he told me that he had been paying Delega for 3 years and had believed that he would be paying for the rest of his life, and that he had stopped being able to imagine his life without that weight on it, and that he was not sure yet what to do with the absence of the weight, which was a sensation he had not expected and could not quite name. I told him that the absence of a weight you have carried for a long time feels strange before it feels like freedom, and that the strangeness passes. He nodded. He came to Mass every Sunday after that, and he looked, across the years I remained in Biała Podlaska, like a man who had remembered something about himself that he had almost forgotten. That is what I was trying to accomplish. Not the arrest, though the arrest was necessary. Not the convictions, though the convictions were just. What I was trying to accomplish was the return of something to 12 families and a market town in eastern Mazovia that Marek Dolega had been systematically taking from them for 4 years. The ability to imagine their own lives without his weight in the center of them. I accomplished it with 11 days of paying attention and 7 pages of organized observation, and the understanding that the most powerful thing available to a woman whom dangerous men do not consider worth noticing is the fact that they do not consider her worth noticing. I have never found a more effective instrument than that specific invisibility, and I have never needed one.